hopefully we get some folks joining us, but this is Christiana from the Historical Museum and
Emily,
and
Core.
Hopefully you guys had a chance to watch our video that we recorded yesterday where we bopped around different sites at the Historical Museum in the Fort grounds and talked about the 1918 flu, but we're back today to continue the discussion. So if you're out there and you're watching, go ahead and say hello so we know that you're there. And then if you have questions, we'd love to hear it. Otherwise, we will just ramble about the 1918 flu. We've got some cool stuff to show you and some more stories to tell that we didn't get to yesterday on our tour. So feel free to chime in when you're checking things out, and then we will just tell you some stories. So, but open to any questions at any point. So,
Yep.
First of all, Emily, why do we have donuts today other than that they're delicious?
Okay, so we have donuts today because during the 1918 flu and World War I is when donuts came to be. So donuts were heavily associated with the nurses in the Salvation Army, both as they were tending to the sick and the injured from the war. So we have the official donut story from
It's
the
official,
Salvation.
guys.
It's official.
It's official.
From the Salvation Army, and it goes, since 1917, when a cheerful Salvation Army lassie handed a fresh donut to a homesick doughboy in France, the Salvation Army donut has symbolized loving concern for those in the armed forces. In 1917, young Helen Purviance, an ensign in the Salvation Army, was sent to France to work with the American 1st Division. Putting her Hoosier ingenuity to work, she and her fellow officer, Ensign Margaret Sheldon, patted the first dough into a shape by hand, but soon employed an ordinary wine bottle as a rolling pin. Since they had no donut cutter, the lassies used a knife to cut the dough into strips and then twisted them into crullers. And then the story continues on, talking about how they only were able to fry up maybe 150 the first day, and then they became such high demand they eventually started making 9,000 donuts a day. And then one of the soldiers asked if they could start making them with holes in them, and so they did, and they enlisted the help of a blacksmith to make the cutter for them so that they would all come out very uniformed.
So all you guys out there, please comment with your favorite donut. Are you a cruller kind of person? Are you maple? We've got some Krispy Kreme donuts here because they look the most like sort of old-fashioned fried donuts to me. But I'm a maple bar person myself. I don't know. Yeah.
And then we found these really cool pictures of the nurses serving up donuts on the front lines and in the different tents, which is kind of cool. You can see the just piles and piles of donuts.
If my dad is watching, that's definitely donuts. He's a big donut fan. That would probably be a good serving for just my dad.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe if I was in there.
Yeah.
So that's why we have donuts. We thought, like, with all of the less than fun things to talk about when we're talking about the 1918 flu, at least we could include donuts in the story.
Yeah.
So I'll scooch these out of the way so that we can talk about other things. A little while later, we're going to get around to making some paper cups as water cups. So if you've got kiddos at home and you want to follow along with us, or if you're just curious, you could just grab a piece of printer paper, and then a little while later, we're going to get into how to make those too. So, many of you guys are experiencing the stay-at-home order and maybe fears about the COVID virus, and it's brought up a lot of parallels with the 1918 influenza epidemic or pandemic for good reasons. Sorry, I just said tap to invite somebody. Anyway, for good reason, because it's the last really big pandemic that we've had to deal with in our country. And it's kind of interesting to see the parallels here. So in Missoula, the flu really started to become a problem here in early October of 1918. Now, we should probably talk a little bit about what was going on in 1918. So at that point, the U.S. had joined World War I. It had already been going on for several years. But a lot of people were gathering together for patriotic parades or things to do with war bonds and trying to really show their support for the troops, understandably. And as you might imagine, that meant close quarters, people close together.
Yeah.
And so that was a real recipe for the spread of disease. So a lot of the things that were suggested by health officials back in 1918 aren't too dissimilar to what's being suggested now. So Emily, can you remember some of the things that they did to try to prevent the spread?
Yeah, so they encourage face masks just like we are. We've even got some cool pictures of them, which is really kind of fun.
This one's the best.
The Patriots wear masks. Yeah. Yep. Love to see it. And so it's kind of interesting, you know, we found some pictures where everybody walking around in the streets and stuff kind of looks how we do today, which was
less fashionable.
No, not
Darth
as many
Vader
designs. Yeah. But it was kind of eerily similar, which was, for me, just a little weird to look at. But then they also closed down businesses, but then they also argued which businesses should be deemed essential and stay open. So they did have a lot of, you know, similar practices that we are having. You know, they didn't have a complete understanding of germs yet. And so the washing of the hands, and later when we learn about the paper cups, kind of sharing different utensils without washing them maybe was not as in practice as it is today. But yeah, not too different from today.
Yeah,
really.
it is pretty interesting. We didn't bring it out here. So a lot of these panels that we're looking at right now are from a previous exhibit that we had up before I worked here about the 1918 flu. And then we've been also looking at our World War I exhibit. You would have seen some of those panels yesterday when we were walking around the fort. But what's interesting is they did close the schools, including UM. And actually on the UM website in the archives, there's a really great little mini exhibit that you can access, and I'll make sure that the link is in this after we're done with the live stream. But also a diary. There's a diary available from a student that was there, and it kind of goes through his experience of, you know, being in school and everything's normal, and then things getting gradually shut down, and then UM shut down to all students, I think, in October.
Yeah.
And then it didn't reopen again until January. But anyway, it's kind of interesting because they shut down the schools, and they shut down most businesses, but they did allow saloons to stay open. And Emily, do you remember what their sort of their safety precautions were for the saloons?
Yes, there is a quote in an article I read that said, "A reasonable amount of alcohol is better than too much medicine." So as long as you could keep drinking reasonably, it was better than overdosing on your medicine.
Oh, well, there you go. And I know that they did take out bar stools and things like that, so that they were able to keep, in theory, getting folks to move on after they'd had their drink.
Get your drink and get out.
Yeah, we're speculating, was that the beginning of the bar crawl where you started at 1? I guess that would sort of defeat the purpose of hygiene. But I think one thing that I've noticed too, and we've got, I'll pick it up in a minute, but a massive bound book of the Missoulian from 1918. It seems like reading the newspaper articles from them, they kind of mirror what we're experiencing through our pandemic too, where at first, you know, the government and the newspapers are trying to like calmly say, you know, this is going to be okay, we have this under control, and then, you know, as the weeks wear on and the numbers go up, there's more concern for things. But there's some really funny ones, like for Anaconda. And if you guys are history nerds and have been interested in the parallels, you may have been noticing that the Missoula Current and the Missoulian have both been publishing sort of retrospective or introspective articles about the parallels between the two of them. This one's from Harmon's History, so this is Jim Harmon, who is a retired broadcaster, and he picked out some really nice quotes about why Anaconda wasn't experiencing the flu in the same way. So I'll read a couple of these over here. So one news dispatch out of Anaconda, but carried around the state by other papers, claimed arsenic and sulfur fumes killed the influenza germs. So germ theory is pretty new at that point, but they're figuring out that nobody's getting it in Anaconda as of November 8th, and that must be because of the arsenic in the air, which was so healthy for everyone, as we all know. The story continues. A remedy has been found to check the flu bug. Anaconda is a city of 16,000 souls. While the epidemic has been raging in nearly every section of Montana, and the hospitals of the larger cities have been taxed to the utmost capacity to take care of the ailing, anaconda snugly ensconced behind her protective screen of smelter smoke and arsenic fumes reports a clean bill of health as far as the influenza is concerned. So then it goes on to discuss the the slight amount of arsenic. It says here, the slight amount of arsenic which escapes the separation process of the biggest smelter stack in the world and gives the anaconda air piquancy and anaconda maidens the rosiest cheeks in the world and makes the hearts of young anacondans beat stronger on the approach of those be-rosed maidens. Also puts an aerial barrage between the bad flu bug and its possible victims. So it goes on to explain, how this arsenic situation is actually much better for anacondans. Also in Polson, which we know is just a bit north of us up by the lake, and they were talking about their leaders put quick action into precautionary measures, and at that point didn't have any flu cases. So they just talked about the good health of people of Polson and that they were in really great shape health-wise. So it's kind of interesting just to see how each little community had their little shout-outs about their health, whether it be because of arsenic or just because they were a healthy community.
Yeah, I was reading something else that Butte was commenting that maybe because there was too much dust in the road is how it was spreading, but then they commented that none of the road cleaners who were breathing in all the dust, none of them were sick.
Okay.
And none of the butchers were sick either.
Okay, yeah, so all kinds of different theories there. I'm sure any of you who spend time on Facebook have read some very interesting theories about the COVID virus and why people are or aren't getting it. But the reality is that a lot of people did get it in Montana, and I didn't bring my notes with me, but it was something like, I want to say 1% of the population of Montana. Mm-hmm. So it was an extensive, if you think, a lot of times 1% doesn't sound like that much, but if you're talking about 1% of 5,000 or 1% of 50,000, that's quite a large amount of people. Mm-hmm. And so, much like we've been talking about now, there were a couple of different waves of influenza infection. And this one shows both waves, I think.
Yep.
So we have our first death we talked about yesterday was one of the Army in training students, the Student Army Training Corps students that was here at Fort Missoula. Mr. Bonewise, I think his name was.
Mr. Bonewise.
And he died on October 9th, right around then. And we can see this, massive peak here, and then it kind of calms down quite a bit. And then you'll notice, we know with the COVID virus is about a 2-week incubation period. So we see this real drop here and then another spike. So what happens on November 11th, 1918?
The war's over!
The war's over, right? So even folks who had been paying great attention to all of the safety concerns, there were rules, new laws about not spitting on the ground. People were finding new ways to separate themselves and quarantine themselves if they did get sick, and really taking more interest in wearing masks and really taking care of themselves and safety. But as soon as the war ended, it was like everybody completely forgot. It was like the overwhelming relief of World War I ending was much more than people could kind of deal with and try to still stay with their ways that they were trying to defeat the virus. It was just too much. There were celebrations, people hugging on the streets, parades, everything like that.
Yeah, large parades.
Huge gatherings, all over the country. But we see this in Montana, in Missoula's influenza issues. You see this spike here. We have November, the 10th of November is here, and then, a few weeks later, by December 1st, we've got this peak again of influenza cases. And it's not as high as that first one, but it's still significant because people had just sort of shrugged off all of their safety precautions that they'd been having earlier. And then, of course, it dies down a bit, and then this one stops towards the end of March, but you can see it really slows down. And this first marker here is 50 cases. So just to sort of orient, we go between 0 and about 440 here per day. So to compare, we haven't been dealing with the COVID infection as long as this chart does, but I think we've had something around 400 in Montana, I think, and maybe 40-ish in Missoula so far, but that's only within about 2 months, and that's a lot of people paying attention to the precautions and the whole shutdown. So there's stories throughout the 1918 flu of communities that didn't take it seriously, that had, really drastic issues. I remember reading about Philadelphia being one of those.
Philadelphia and San Francisco were the two hardest hit.
Yeah, and a lot of it has to do with, which cities prevented those big celebrations or war bond parades earlier, and which ones, they can actually track it down in Philadelphia to a specific parade.
Yeah.
And soldiers coming from Boston down to Philadelphia and then being in that that whole celebration. So it's really interesting to look back at the historical record and to more than 100 years ago, and we can still pinpoint things like that. So it's going to be really interesting looking at the COVID virus and all of the information that we have now and being able to track it down. And hopefully in 100 years somebody will be reading some of our news headlines and chuckling just like we were chuckling about the ones about Anaconda. So I see Anya is out there. If anybody else is out there and has any questions about Fort Missoula and the flu or the flu in general, or if Anya wants to add something that we haven't thought about yet, I'm happy to chat about that kind of stuff. Otherwise, I'm just going to keep rambling.
Yeah, let's go.
So one of the things that I thought was interesting this is actually the real copy of this, the original copy, is in the archives at UM, and if you ask really nicely to their archivist and make an appointment, I'm sure that you could check this out as well. Not check it out to take home, but to look at it. This is the death records of people who died in Missoula. It's like a public health record. And we've got the dates here starting, let's see, that's October 17th. So starting up here, we've got August 25th up at the top of this, and you can see it, a handwritten record here of all of the people that died at that point. And we have scarlet fever, pulmonary tuberculosis, typhoid fever. So a mix, a couple of smallpoxes here, right over here, kind of in the first little chunk here. But then we have October 5th, October 8th, and we get epidemic influenza, and we have ages on some of them, but not many. And it says it once, and then all we have are those repeating marks there. We've got a 7-year-old and a 4-year-old, a 35-year-old, and then the second page here.
And this is all on one day as well.
Yeah, so here we go. So this one's way back in October 9th. This page here is October 17th. And by October 17th, this probably goes a couple of pages of just epidemic influenza. It was probably all that health recorder person could do, is just to get that name down. And I know that as you get further, when we did our research on the baby and the family that was in the Morgan family in the cemetery, like the days start getting a little bit mixed up. You'll find a death record that doesn't quite match up with the obituary, and that's just because they were having trouble keeping up at that point. So it's kind of it's really sad, but it's just, can show you the impact of something like that. We had a couple of different hospitals in Missoula. One of them was St. Pat's, which is still there. And we have some of the nursing students here that were part of the Sisters of Providence, and then the nursing faculty at the hospital there. There was also the Northern Pacific Hospital, and then they did have to do some temporary hospitals around. Some of you may know the story from our church, St. Michael's Church, that's out here. It started out at Hellgate, and then eventually got moved to the Catholic block, so over by St. Patrick Hospital and St. Francis Xavier. And it had a bunch of different jobs, but it was one of those buildings that would have been repurposed to be extra beds for convalescing during the pandemic there as well. Any thoughts? You want to chat with that?
Yeah. So one of the other really cool graphs we've got talks about different flus and pneumonia in the U.S. So we've got what is MA? So we've got basically pneumonia and influenza mortality by age in 1892. 1918, 1936, and 1957, and all except for 1918, which is our flu, they follow the path of the youngest and the oldest being the most susceptible to mortality, whereas in the 1918 flu we've got this interesting W curve where we've got people in their mid-20s, early 30s who are also highly susceptible to the disease, which I think is really interesting. How we have kind of that different graph going on, why people were so afraid of it, because it was also taking out the strongest part of the population. So it wasn't that they were just looking out for young kids and older adults, but now, you know, the people who are supposed to, you know, help run the country after the fact are also dying at a...
Which would have been a huge hit, especially since so many folks had gone over to fight in World War I, and so you have that same generation being impacted on two levels. And I did hear an interview with Ellen Leahy, who's one of our health officials in Missoula County, and she had done a lot of research on older pandemics like this, and she said that one of the reasons why this could have happened was because a healthy immune system might act excessively to attack the infection, and so that's why it was like producing too much stuff in the lungs because it was trying to fight off the infection too much, whereas the little guys and the older people maybe not as much with that. But the other thing I heard was that there may have been a previous, even though this is a novel flu virus, kind of like we have a novel coronavirus, there may have been some slight, what do you call it, when you have exposure to another disease. So there might have been an earlier flu virus that was similar enough to this one that it didn't affect the older folks as much because they had some immunity to it. That was the word that I was looking for. Yeah. So, got that one. Oh, let's pull out the book. The giant book. It's a heavy one.
It is.
So we have a couple of these bound versions of the Missoulian, which is fascinating just on its own. But we found Friday morning, October 11th, 1918, there is an article in here that says, no decrease in the ravages of the flu. It says, Army camps show slight improvement, civilian conditions are worse. And it goes through not necessarily just Fort Missoula, but the entire impact on the Army as a whole and the conditions that they were having. And then it also says at that point we had 1,000 cases in the state of Montana. And it goes on about protecting Camp Lewis, so the things that they were doing to try to mitigate the exposure of people. So, and there, as we go further in October, you definitely see more articles like that. And at the same time, they're still writing about, you know, people being drafted into the war and this very strong patriotism.
I like this headline, keep moving orders obeyed, pool and bar rooms open, but usual crowds are wanting.
Yeah, so they were noticing that it was working out. There's an article over here on this side. Schoolboys won't work until schools reopen, so they are offering kids that should have been in school but weren't because the schools were closed, are offering to work for farmers so that they can get the harvest done. So, yep. Sorry, giant book. Okay. So just before we wrap up, I wanted to just kind of let you guys wrap up a little bit of what we talked about in the video, just in case you haven't had a chance to check that one out. Emily and I made this 6-minute video yesterday where we jumped around the fort to look at different parts that would have been occupied by folks during the 1918 flu. So we started out with the parade grounds and pointed out the barracks and the officers' row, and we really wanted to start there because although it wasn't intentional, of course, for the Army to spread the disease, just the nature of Army barracks at that time in close quarters and shared utensils and tools and things like that, the influenza infections really spread heavily through the Army barracks. And then at the same time, we had the Student Army Training Corps at University of Montana and at Fort Missoula. So we had students who were interacting with the soldiers that were here that had infections maybe that they brought from another part of the country. And at the same time, the soldiers were allowed to go into town on Sundays. So shortly, the day after one of their Sunday leaves, 25 of them had to get quarantined in the post hospital here because they had symptoms of the flu.
Yep.
And then that first death in Missoula County was of a student Army Training Corps person, and that was on either the 7th or the 9th, I forget, but early in October. And then shortly after that, we had 109 cases in Missoula, I think the next day. Yeah, so it spread super quickly. And then our final stop on the tour, we went out to the Post Cemetery, and hopefully we'll get to do another Stories and Stones out there where we can tell the stories of some of the folks that were buried out there. But we learned about the Morgan family, a young woman and her infant child who both died of influenza at the end of October and early November. And she was married to a soldier who had been at Fort Missoula that had been transferred to California. So even though she probably didn't have a direct contact at the fort at that point, it was still spreading through the community. So, and I find that if you look at other communities around the United States that you hear similar stories to that. So, and then there's another one about Hazel Loader that we didn't get to, and I forgot to bring the panel down here, but a lot of times young nurses would come out of retirement, say you went to nursing school and then you got married and then you weren't going to be a nurse anymore, but they felt compelled to come and help because we had such a shortage of doctors and nurses because of World War I. And Hazel came from Great Falls to help out in Missoula, and she ended up contracting the virus and dying. So you hear these stories all the time. Yeah. So that's just a little tidbit into the 1918 flu story. If you watch this later and you have questions, please feel free to comment and we'll get back to you. I will also share links to things, and then an important thing to remember is that we are collecting history for this history for our response to the COVID virus. So I'll also share the link. It's a partnership between many historical organizations in Missoula, and we're a part of that. It's run through the archives at So I'll share you a link for that. Everybody is part of this history right now, and it's really a great idea to be collecting history while it's happening. So unless there's any last questions.
Did you want to do the cups?
Oh, I forgot about the cups. See, this is why Emily's here for lots of reasons. Yeah. I totally forgot about that. Okay, so it wouldn't be a lunch and learn without a craft. So we talked a lot about how folks weren't really as familiar with germs as we are today. And so a lot of times you would have, a big ceramic pitcher and then a cup that was shared to get drinks. So at this point they realized that was a really great way to spread disease. So you could make little paper cups out of anything that you had around. So we're starting today with just a regular piece of printer paper, and we are going to fold it so that you can make it into a square eventually. So I'm taking one corner and pulling it up to the side so it looks like that. See, I've taken this corner, pulled it up to the side, and then if you didn't have scissors, you could just fold that in, but we've got scissors, so we're going to cut off the extra bit, save it for another craft. That's what we do. Okay, so now it just looks like a triangle. Emily's folding. Well, you can do whatever you want. Okay. So, we have our triangle. It's a square if we unfold it, but it's a triangle. We want that thing folded. Emily's cutting.
Getting there.
She's getting there. It's all good. All right. So we've got our triangle. Now you're going to take one corner and you're going to fold it across to reach the other side. So
like this.
So that it doesn't cross. Let's see.
So it just goes. Okay.
So the tip touches the edge. So I've got my corner here. I'm bringing it across to the edge, so it doesn't overflow. And then you're going to do the same thing to the opposite corner, so it reaches its arm across and it hits the other side. So we got our original one on there, taking this corner, bending it across so it reaches the other side. So now you got kind of reminds me of a cupcake probably because I like baked goods.
That's good. That's good one.
And then you just take your top part and you fold it down. So top is folding down. It's not super pretty, but it's functional. And then you do the same on the opposite side. So I've got I had these guys sticking up like the top of my cupcake. Fold one down that side, and then on the opposite side there. Then you just stick your hand in there, open it up, and now you have a cup. So now you can go get some water out of the pitcher, and hopefully nobody else has drank out of it. So you can at least have some water for a little while. Yeah. What's kind of handy too is that it doesn't sit down, so you can't just like leave it and someone else pick it up too. And our paper probably wouldn't last too long, but it'll get you a couple of drinks. People did make their own masks too, depending on what it was made out of. You know, it was more or less effective. But same thing going on more than 100 years ago. Okay, I think we're really actually done.
I think that's it
now. Okay. Thank you for joining us. Thanks for being there, Anya. And we will be back with you a week from Friday with another Lunch and Learn. So if you have a suggestion for something that you want to learn more about, or we might go do a craft or something like that, let us know. And we'll be back with you again soon. Thanks for joining. See if I can turn this off. Uh-oh. We'll just hang out.
Yeah.
Okay.
There it is.